first discuss or comment on just the company and give you just some insights to Zealand as a company. And then I'll move into my own experience working in the life science industry. But first and foremost, I'm just very excited to see that so many of you find it interesting to see what kind of opportunities there is in the life science industry. And I can say for my own part that I'm working in the life science industry mainly because of two things, and I'll explore that a bit further in the end of this talk. But it is first and foremost because I really enjoy science. I find it fascinating to work with science, and I've done it already since I worked in academia. But then, and you'll hear more about that, it's kind of been more important to me to focus on, in my work life, to provide some input to, or to work with some science where I think it has a tangible benefit for patients. So that's kind of the motivational side. Then also it is, I mean, perhaps on a more selfish note for myself to progress my thinking within science and be more sharp on certain scientific elements and understand what you could do with science on a bigger level to impact disease areas and also treatment options for patients. But starting on Zealand Pharma, I'm here sharing the Zealand DNA, which is the values of the company that's asked of all employees to keep in mind in everything we do. So the first one is that we are bold. And I think this speaks also a bit to the history of the company. Starting as a biotech company for 20 years ago, focused on kind of the improving the chemical properties of peptides to make them druggable. And a lot of the work was around the chemistry and the preclinical side. And now we are scaling this up to be a fully integrated biotechnology company that also has a commercial function so that we can market the drugs that we develop ourselves. Then also the second point is that we should be trusted. So that is something that is very important for the company to, I mean, we're working with patients and wanting to provide treatment options for patients. So we should of course be trusted in everything we do around the patients and keep them in mind. Then also we should find better solution, and that is something that is asked for all employees to I mean, be creative, come up with great solutions to scientific problems, and if they're good, then they should be implemented. So that's also a little bit about the agility of working in a small company. And that leads me to the next point, which is that we take advantage of that size, because being a small company makes it possible to be more agile. So a decision is not necessarily something that needs to go through many levels of management, but something that can be implemented quite fastly if it's relevant. And then also with all the expansion that's going on now and us taking on a lot of different areas, that leads to opportunities. I'll just, yeah. It's just a waiting room that's popping up. So with that comes also a lot of opportunities. And I think that a lot of employees in Zealand, if they have a special interest area or something that makes sense for the company, there is also that agility to make it happen. Then, without going too much into the history, I already mentioned that Zealand started as a biotechnology company focusing on the chemistry and improving peptide properties to be able to make it druggable. And then it led to collaborations with bigger pharma companies in the clinical domain. But now we're taking on that part ourselves, and that has led to a metabolic franchise being led by glucagon. This is perhaps the area that is most relevant to use in the diabetic field. But glucagon is a glucagon analog that's possible to formulate in an aqueous solution that gives it has the potential then to be used across many different indications. And then for the gastrointestinal franchise, and this is what I'm working with, we have glepaglutide, which is a long-acting GLP-2 analog for short bowel syndrome. And then we also have a novel GLP-1 and GLP-2 co-agonist that is the next generation for short bowel syndrome, which I'm responsible for on the medical side. And that leads me to the pipeline of all our activities. And you can see this is quite a big pipeline for a company in the size of us. And you can see the fields in the top there, the 4 rows with dasiglucagon being explored across many different indications. Then we have the SBS activities, so glepaglutide, as I mentioned, and the dual co-agonist with the GLP-1, GLP-2. Then you can see we also have collaborations because that part of the, spirit of Zealand still prevails, that there are some opportunities that are explored with partnerships. But as you see, also a great deal where we are driving them ourselves. And you can also see with the length of this bar here that a lot of them also are in the preclinical space. And that's perhaps, I could understand that you come from a great, different number of backgrounds, right? So some of you maybe more on the preclinical side and on the biological in animals preclinical aspect, that area, and some of you may be medical doctors and where it's more phase 1 to phase 3 that's relevant. Yes, so I wanted just to mention, just since you're in the diabetic space, some of the indications that's being explored for dasiglucagon. And the most obvious here is HypoPal, a rescue pen for severe hypoglycemia, where it can be formulated in a pen that can be dosed. So an NDA is filed there, so that's quite far in the development. Then there's also dasiglucagon being explored in ultra-rare disease called congenital hyperinsulinism, where phase 3 studies are ongoing. And I think that speaks a little bit to some of the values, right? That if something makes sense and it makes sense for patients, then it's something that we should explore if it makes sense. And I think these different indications, so here also the dual hormone artificial pancreas here, that's also being explored in collaboration with another company. And then also mini doses of glucagon for hypoglycemia in type 1 and following bariatric surgery. Now that leads me to the end of kind of this brief description of Zealand Pharma, because a lot of things is going on, and this year was particularly significant for Zealand. We started this journey of going towards a fully integrated company where we are doing everything ourselves, and we have the vision to have 5 commercialized products by 2025. As I mentioned, this year the commercial foundation was established by the acquisition of a US-based company in that field. Then we have 4 late-stage assets, and as I showed, then a robust pipeline also in the early space and on the preclinical activities. We have 2 licensed partnerships with Alexion and Boehringer Ingelheim, as you saw, and we have significantly increased the number of employees up to 313. So now with that, I'd like to, and of course with that raise in employees, and also with all the activities going on, that's also something that increases our demand for PhDs and postdocs across many different functions. And so with that, I'd like to transition over to my career and let you know a little bit about what caused me to shift from an academic career and into a career in life science. And the thinking has kind of, I've reflected a lot on what am I trying to achieve in my career, and what do I enjoy also. Started out off during my medical studies with doing some pre-graduate work in immunoassays and also characterizing gastrointestinal drug hormones, and I found that really exciting. And then I worked some years in the clinic, also find some meaningfulness in that. I just want to focus more on the science, and that kind of led me to thinking that what I would like to achieve with the science should also provide a tangible benefit for patients, because that's something that I find meaningful and something that I can look back on my work and see, okay, so I did that, and that has resulted in this meaningful, tangible benefit. And it has also been, as I mentioned, that I strive to be smarter and smarter on science and try to build up competency within drug development. And I'll just show you a timeline here of my activities. And as I mentioned, I started doing research while I was studying medicine. And then in 2015, I graduated as a medical doctor and started this KBU, or clinical basis education for doctors. So that's what most doctors do when they are finished with their medical studies. They go and work in the clinic for a year. And then after that, I started a residency in clinical biochemistry, because this is where I also did my research, so I could pursue, or I could continue those activities then while having the residency in clinical biochemistry. And therefore, I could also submit my PhD thesis in the end of that, especially because I've done a lot of research while studying medicine, and I had all the papers ready for PhD submission then. And then I made the first kind of jump into the industry and started on the pharmaceutical medicine program at Novo Nordisk. And I made that jump because, as I mentioned, I also felt that I should kind of challenge myself with doing something else. And I didn't see myself following that exact research field that I had started on in my academic career. So I wanted to try something else and be challenged. And I felt that going into the industry would expose me to a lot of science and a lot of discussions that was going on at a high level, where we also had input from, I mean, when you work in the industry, you also get acquainted to some of the key opinion leaders in the field. And having that kind of dynamics with those key opinion leaders, I felt could make me understand what's going on in the very top scientific field, and what kind of considerations do they make, and I could probably learn from that. And I really felt that I learned a lot during my time there at Novo Nordisk. And from a medical point of view, I also explored all the medical functions that you can have in the medical industry. So one is in medical affairs, working with communication and scientific interpretation of clinical data. Then also clinical development, where you construct the clinical development programs and interpret the data and see what's the next steps that we have to make in this development program to have a drug that can come onto the market. And then also in global safety, where you can work with looking into the adverse events in clinical trials and look at the safety profile and how that can be explored, and how you can understand and mitigate some of the risks that comes with the drug. And then I had the opportunity to get a role in Zealand Pharma, where I felt I could challenge myself even more and get more responsibility as well. So I took that, and I've been very happy to work at Zealand ever since. Now that's kind of the overall kind of timeline of my career. And I received some questions from Jette that I'll go through now. And the first question is related to what extent that I feel that I use the competencies that I've developed in my academic career. And here I think it's kind of a twofold answer, so to say. So of course, when you deal with a an area within science in your PhD or postdoc, and you've kind of dealt with that, then of course you get a competency in that field, and it would be kind of an obvious next step to say, okay, so I'm going to kind of expand that or work with that, and I'm an expert in that field, and then progress that. And for all of you, most of you, it's probably within the diabetes field, so you could move into the diabetes field and kind of explore that area that you're already experts in. But the other angle could also be that by now you have learned a lot about not only your area, but also science and academic science in general. So you know how to interpret literature, you know how to look at guidelines, you know how to set up protocols for studies and all of that. And that's a more kind of general skill set that you can also use in other fields. So for my own sake, I mean, I worked in academia within basic science. So with these immunoassays and analyzing hormones in the gut and in the brain. And of course, that's a very limited area of expertise. So I went into Novo Nordisk then working with diabetes, which is, I mean, I didn't use a lot on the exact science that I did back in my research days, but I had that kind of scientific understanding, and I think that led me to then to move into the industry, work with diabetes at first. Then I also worked with obesity and also with cardiovascular disease, and now I work with short bowel syndrome, among other GI conditions. So it was kind of a segue into the industry, and then that led me to build up new competencies. And that leads me then to, I mean, what kind of skills or kind of methodologies I work with now in my current day job. And I think that in the beginning, it was kind of this general scientific skill set, right? You know how to interpret data, you know how to come up with scientific hypotheses, what is robust, what is not robust, and that skill set. But then when you're in the life science industry for a number of years, then you also gain a skill set within drug development. So you get to see what does it take to take a drug from I mean, just animal studies, and then on to you can go into patients, and then you can get it on the market. So with that, you get a lot of understanding of cross-functional understanding. So you get statistical insights, you get regulatory insights. So, I mean, what do the regulators think, and what kind of regulations are there in clinical trials? You also get insights into the commercial part, because that's of course also something that's considered. Here you need to weigh the commercial aspects with the medical aspects as well. So that kind of cross-functional skill set is something you gain over time. And so Jette mentioned this a little bit in the introduction, that I work with designing clinical trials, designing clinical development programs. So, you know, you should start with this trial, then move into this, and what kind of scientific information do you get at which point of the life cycle. Yes, so you need to think all these matters throughout, I mean, the whole program. So I work with that, and then also there's a lot of collaboration with many different skill areas. So as I mentioned, regulatory, commercial, but also on the preclinical side. So I work a lot on with toxicologists also, and it kind of, you get to see how many functions that are truly engaged in drug development. And for many of you, I believe that you are in the preclinical field as well, where there's also a great number of preclinical activities that go on, of course, before you move into to patients, but also along with once the drug is in the clinic, because then you need to figure out what is the scientific story, and you need to at all times advance your thinking about what does this drug do and how do you explore those kind of the biology around that. And that moves me into the calendar. So now I explained a little bit about what my activities are. So one of the keywords being cross-functional. So my calendar is kind of generally, it's of course in the weekdays, Monday through Friday, where you're expected in the office from 9 to 3. And it is very flexible. So, I mean, it gains some flexibility, at least me as a clinician. It may be a little bit different if you work with the animal studies. Perhaps there you need to, of course, tend to that. But otherwise, there's a great deal of flexibility. And typically, it's not weekends, right? So that's a change from the clinical side. I mean, you could get to work during daytime. And then, of course, there are some peak areas, right? So sometimes if you have a deliverable or something that you need to hand over or to deliver on, then I mean you could have long work hours to be able to reach a good result, and that's of course expected of you then. But besides that, I mean, I typically go into the office now. I'm at home, of course, due to Corona, and I've been for quite a while. But before that, it was very much going into the office, and you had your, I mean, base at your desk where you kind of did your work. And then once in a while there were meetings, so you had to attend to a meeting with either something was going on with a clinical study or something you needed to attend to and talk with some of your colleagues. And it's in an open office space, so you can go in and have a chat with regulatory, for instance, if you want to get their input on something. So I mean, just at the moment, I'm engaged in, I think it is around 7 trials, clinical trials, something like that. So of course I cannot go into, I'm not handling every aspect of those trials, but I'm very much focused on the science around it, and that's the particular part that I enjoy, that I get to focus and have an increased amount of time working on science and not a lot of practical aspects, because there's another department for that. So by that, I think that I'm optimizing the amount of time that I'm spending on scientific questions. And that leads me to the work-life balance. And I think this is a tricky question, because I mean, it's very individual. What's a good work-life balance? So I believe I have a good work-life balance because I do what I think I should do, and that's an individual basis. So if of course you are ambitious and you would like to, I mean, advance and get more responsibility, higher positions, and all of that, then perhaps you should step it up and work more, and then you can get yourself noticed, right? So that could be a consideration. But I mean, if you are happy with what you're doing, then I think there's no reason why you shouldn't, at the most time, be able to just, I mean, have a 9-to-5 job and work the hours that are expected of you, and then you can deliver what is expected. And it's kind of, I at least see that in the industry, I can fully, I mean, have it as I want with that work-life balance. It's not that I'm being whipped to put in 80 hours of work each week. But yeah, very flexible, and I really enjoy that flexibility. So now the culture then in Zealand, I think it is it's very much based on those early roots in biotech, which is then also reflected in the values. So that there is kind of a culture where, I mean, you wear multiple hats. I mean, it's not so that you are kind of put into a position and then this is your area that you have to fill, but you are engaged in a lot of activities, and if it's something you have an interest in working with, or you can contribute within this area, then why not? And then you can kind of, I mean, there's these flexible boundaries, and you are very much counted on to explore that for yourself, so you can kind of put in your work where it's needed from, of course, a company point of view, but also where you have your own motivations. And then to wrap up, I was to state why I'm working at Zealand, and I think this is also a bit of what I started out by saying, that, I mean, one thing is kind of my overall motivation for working in the life science industry and working at Zealand. It is because I think that the scientific work that I do there has a meaningful benefit for patients. And of course, I mean, I've also thought about that because I also did that to some extent when I worked in basic science, but it's just in a more kind of untangible way that you provide it to the scientific community. That's where you provide your benefits, and then that in time may, of course, lead to a lot of benefits to patients and to the scientific community. But just for me, being involved in developing clinical trials and figuring out, so this is the drug, this is the biology, what meaningful benefits can you do for patients, and which patients are the most suitable to receive this drug. Then you can kind of define how a drug should be used in patients, and if many patients use it, then you impact many patients' lives. So I think that's point number one. And then point number two is about the culture and what kind of mandate you have. That I feel that in Zealand, I get to work with what I enjoy the most, so science, and I can progress my scientific understanding because I'm being challenged all the time and by a lot of different functions. So, I mean, to me, as in the clinical development space, these are the stakeholders that I mentioned to you. So regulatory and commercial, and also the preclinical and the toxicologist, but also on the patent side. So what is the use of a patent, and how do you need to think that into your activities? So you also gain information about, I mean, a whole industry, right? So it's not only about the science, but also about those other functions that use the science. All right, so that was my last comment. So I believe, Jette, you will moderate some of the questions.
Yes, thank you very much for really a great presentation, Mikkel. If you have any questions for Mikkel, please either write your name in the chat or write your question directly in the chat. So please take a minute to reflect on questions for Mikkel. Okay, and the questions are starting to come. There's a question from Marie. She's asked, do you have personal responsibility? If yes, was that also a skill you got through the PMP program?
All right, so I don't have anybody reporting to me, but I mean, in the PMP program, I mean, there is some focus on leadership, right? And I think, at least in the industry, it's often, I mean, the medical role is often connected with some leadership and some giving guidance, but kind of from an organizational point of view, those leadership roles is in many ways, it's to people who are in other functions. So that will mean they will have another functional head. So that's a little bit about what I mentioned about the cross-functional work that you do. So for instance, when you are responsible for the clinical trial, it is about the scientific part of the clinical role. So there are other people who, for instance, are responsible for checking things and for so monitoring the data, right? And if you need to make changes to the clinical trial, then to make protocol amendments and to submit that to the regulatory authorities and all of those kind of practical aspects. And that's not something that you as a medical doctor do, but that's another function taking care of that. So you don't have those people reporting into you, but you're the one saying, I think we should do this, so please let's do that. Let's do that, and could you perhaps do that? And so it's kind of a leadership role in some ways, but not a personnel responsibility as such.
And she said, okay, thanks. So in Zealand, it's more like a team effort.
Yes, yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. So you have, I mean, of course you come to the teamwork in different ways, right? So you as, I mean, if you're a clinician, then of course you have the clinical mandate and you are responsible for giving that input, but you have other people responsible for something else, right? And of course you can say, okay, from a practical standpoint, I don't think you can do that, but I mean, yeah, you're right. It is teamwork, but where each and every person has, I mean, their own individual responsibilities to deliver on, and that's a little bit where that kind of personnel responsibility comes in, right? Because I mean, your medical judgment and clinical judgment can need the input from someone else, right? And then you have that leadership role where you say, that's just simply needed from my expertise or kind of area point of view. So please go ahead and do that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And there's a question from Marianne. She says, nice talk and very inspiring. How did you find the first transition from academia to Novo and the PMP program? And why did you end up there at Novo Nordisk?
So I ended up there because I was advised to. So when I was considering moving into the life science industry, I called a lot of senior people in different companies and asked them to comment on what they think would be the best career path and what would, I mean, be a good way to move into the industry. And I mean, when you come from, I mean, academic research as a clinic or a kind of medical doctor, and you move into the industry, there's a lot of things that you don't know, and you can't lift a whole clinical development program or something like that. So you need to be able to get into a role where you can learn, and you need to go in where you think there's a good learning environment. I think that's important. And just to touch upon the part about what surprised me, I mean, I was engaged with in the academic field by conducting all the studies myself, right? So I did all the kind of the essays and all the lab work. Then I had, of course, some, I mean, looking into literature and writing up papers and so on. But when I came into Novo and got acquainted to the industry, I could see how many people are just involved in this and how, I mean, for you to make good, sound medical decisions, that's of course based on your medical expertise, but it has an interplay with many other functions. And that's really what I felt, that, I mean, the decisions you make will influence a lot of other functions. So it'll influence, I mean, the communication points of the trial. It's gonna influence, yeah, there's just so many components to it. So I felt that, I mean, I got exposed to many professional areas that I hadn't thought of. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah. So I think that was probably the most most of it.
Yeah, thank you. I can see there's no more questions in the chat, so you still have a last chance. Also welcome to ask your question live. If you prefer that, then just write your name in the chat. But if there's no more questions, then
I can perhaps elaborate a little bit, because now I've had time to think a little bit more about what kind of changed my, what surprised me, and I think it's also about, I mean, when you're in academia, you then, I mean, at least I had a small field, right? I did some research that I felt was interesting on the chemical composition of certain hormones in the GI tract, and I could provide papers and wrote papers on, I mean, how, I mean, in theories these could work, and I mean, real basic science. But then moving into the industry, I got an insight into, I mean, clinical research. So how, I mean, clinical studies are conducted, and how the interplay is between science and how you can, I mean, with a scientific experiment or just a clinical trial, how you can affect, for instance, the treatment guidelines, or just how that interplay is there between academia and industry. Because I mean, there are a lot of opportunities there that I don't believe I was, I mean, familiar with those opportunities before. I mean, that interplay, how do you with science go in, and with the results of a scientific experiment, something can influence on clinical decision making. And that's a little bit, I mean, you get exposed to many new areas in the industry.
Okay, there is one more question. How is the work atmosphere also in regard to co-workers? Is it in general a faster work environment than in academia?
I believe it is. I mean, my experience in academia was, I mean, limited to perhaps 5 people or something like that. Whereas when I'm looking at my, I mean, there comes a report in Outlook each week where I can see how many people I collaborated with, and it's in the 60s, right? So at the meetings and in discussion, you have a lot of more. I mean, yes, stakeholders is something you hear a lot in the industry, right? But you have a lot of people who have interests, or whose work is dependent on you. So therefore, you need to, I mean, you have many more co-workers. Then also, I think there is an atmosphere in general that you can ask anyone about anything, and then they will be happy to answer. I mean, you don't work in silos, in the sense that, I mean, if you would like to get some chemistry input, then you need to, I mean, if you're lucky, then you can get a time. I mean, you just take the phone, you call that person, you say, oh, do you have 5 minutes? And yes, of course, they always have 5 minutes. And there's, I think, a spirit that everybody, I mean, they're in it for the same purpose, and everybody has to, I mean, collaborate in order to, I mean, to succeed, and everybody knows that. So I think there is a good working environment across co-workers that, I mean, and also, I mean, a very friendly spirit. So I mean, there's a lot of social activities and opportunities if you're into that. There's a brewing team at Zealand, so you can brew your own beer, and biking team, and I think there's a lot of social initiatives as well, and also bike team and running team, and yeah, there's no limits to to that.
Okay, thank you. I hope that was the answer to that question. And there's a question from yeah, I don't know who it is, but it's SSTE. You told us that you called some senior person in industry for advice on career. Did you know them, or did you just call them And she also asked, do you have any advice to us if we want to pursue a career in medical industries?
Okay, so the first question about who, I think I just wrote a message on LinkedIn, and I especially looked at someone where, and I think that's a little bit the thinking you'd like to, keep in mind. What's your end goal? I mean, if you see someone with your background where you can see, okay, so in the industry, this would be a role figure for me. This seems to be a person who's involved in a lot of interesting stuff. Then, send that message to that person. It looks like, you have very much the role that I would like in time to develop. Do you have 15 minutes to spare some advice and and I think that's also something that you need to do. You need to then figure out, is this person really doing something that you think is interesting? Because it may that this person, we talked about personnel responsibility. If that's a road you want to go, then a lot of your work is around growing employees, right? It's perhaps not so much in the science itself. Then you should have an expertise function, because if you have people reporting into you, then you have to look at development plans. You have to look at, this person is calling in sick all the time, and you need to replace and have a new FTE, head person to fulfill a function and to collaborate on how do we, increase the output of this function. So it'll be a completely different role you would have in such a case. But I think reaching out to someone where you think this person has an interesting working life, and then hearing, how do you then get to that? And that can be, depending on your background and want for your career, it could be very different people that you would have to reach out to. Now, was there a second question that I forgot here while talking about this?
There's one from Martin. Now, the one just before.
Yeah.
She also asked, do you have any advices to us if we want to pursue a career in the medical industries?
Yeah, so I think, I think it is to look for jobs where you can get acquainted, where you think there is a good working environment. And I would especially put emphasis on who are you working under and what are those values, right? So if you have a boss, it's not a one-way discussion. It's not, where you send in an application, then you're lucky to get interviewed, and then you should do everything to get that job. But you should, also have expectations for the boss. What kind of tasks are you lifting? What responsibilities would you gain, and how will that be a stepping stone to what you want to do? And of course that depends on what you want to get good at, because I think you should aim to oh, there's some noise on the line.
Mute her, so
okay, great. So yeah, no problem. So you need to go in and get a position where, the work that you're doing there is crucial in what competencies you want to build. So I can say for my own sake, I want to be good at making clinical drug development programs, to be able to look at preclinical data and see, wow, this looks promising, or this has some pitfalls. We need to have this study undertaken to explore that opportunity before we move into clinical trials in patients. And then we need to construct the development program like this, so we can explore those risks in the beginning, and then we can leverage and find out who are the most important candidates, and kind of figure all this through. It's a very complex competency, and for the success of that, you need to look at many different factors. You need to have an idea about the practical aspects of what you're undertaking, the commercial success, and also the competitive space and the clinical field where it's moving. So it's very cross-functional. So I try to, get exposure to those areas as much as possible. And I think just from a starting point entry into the industry, I mean, first of all, it's on what shelf are you landing? So if you're a clinician, are you in the medical affairs field where you are about interpreting data and communicating that to internal and external stakeholders? Is it clinical development where you are, as I, working on the clinical trials, or is it global safety where you are looking more detailed into side effects and the safety point of view? So you need to do your homework and figure out in which of these areas what would be the best fit for me from a working life point of view and also kind of a professional point of view.
Okay, thank you. And there's a question from Martin. He says, thank you for the talk. During a PhD, you have the possibility to take courses focusing on the life science industry. Can you recommend any courses, if you know any, like GCP courses?
Yeah, I think definitely if you have insights into GCP, that would be a pro, definitely. Yeah, I think it should be very much directed from your interests and what you think is interesting, because I don't think, I mean, if it is to be attractive for a future employer, I think they will not look so much at which courses you've taken. If you can underline it in your resume that you have a keen interest in the life science, and you can back that up by saying, okay, so I took a GCP course or I took this course, then that of course will be an advantage. You can spin it like that as such. But otherwise, I don't think that a lot of coursework besides actually GCP. I think that's a good concept to be aware of. And if you in your PhD have been doing clinical studies, that's definitely a pro.
Okay, thank you. I think that was the last question, and the time is also running. So thank you very much to you, Mikkel. That was really inspiring and interesting. But before you